Welcome to the Life Giver podcast. My name is Corey Weathers, and I am so excited to share with you as a finale to the 2018 series, a Life Giver story that is really important to me. And I'm so honored to bring Heather Turner onto the podcast and onto the Facebook page too, because this is going to be a video that we're going to be specially sharing on Facebook as well. And so I'm going to tell you all about Heather here in just a minute, but I just wanted to say welcome, Heather. Thank you for joining me.
Hello.
We are so excited to have you here. This episode, if you will, or this conversation is all about your story and how it's being portrayed currently. You are the wife of an active duty Army chaplain currently, but there is a movie called Indivisible that's coming out October 26, 2018, just in case you're watching or listening to this much later, that is based off of your story and your marriage. And it's a vulnerable story. It's a story that all of us can relate to, especially those of us that are in the military, or even some of our first responder couples that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later here. But it's a vulnerable story of your marriage. And so I want to say thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for having this conversation today. I know it's going to be really meaningful to a lot of people.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you. I appreciate you having this discussion with families, particularly military families and first responders families.
Yeah. So what I think we could do is just kind of jump right in. What I would actually love to know is, this movie is a lot about your first assignment as a couple, your first deployment and what that was like. But I'd love for you to take us back a little bit and actually share with us maybe a little bit about your story of how did you guys decide to come in as an active duty Army chaplain family? It's not something that all pastors, ministers, youth ministers choose to do. So tell me a little bit about how you guys made that decision.
Well, I would have to back up to before we even met. Darren and I had both served overseas in missions and in Asia. And so when we met, we were back in the United States, but we always had a desire to be in some form of missions. And so we worked at the University of Georgia in international student ministry, and that was wonderful. Darren also worked part-time on church staff as their campus outreach pastor. And, as we grew older and we started having kids, we started thinking, I just don't know if this is our long-term fit to be on a college campus. We were getting older and the students were getting younger. At the same time, 9/11 happened. Mm-hmm. And about that time, we really started praying just for the Lord's direction in our life and what that would look like. Now, I had always thought that Darren would be a great fit for the military. He's just he's a guy's guy. He's just kind of rough around the edges. He actually wasn't a great fit for church ministry. And so he took a weekend away. Every January he would go away to pray and fast and just kind of seek direction for our life and review the previous year. And while he was praying, he just felt like the Lord kept bringing up this issue of going into the military. And at that point, we didn't even know in what capacity. So just through a series of circumstances, providentially organized, the Lord had us come in contact with really my spiritual grandmother, who married an Army chaplain, and Suzanne Bracken. Her name is now Suzanne Peck. And so we got in touch with them. They invited us up, shared about what it meant to be a chaplain in the military. And so we walked away from that weekend really feeling confirmed that that's what we would pursue. So we sold our house, sold everything we had, and went off to graduate school.
Well, this is such a common story that I hear. I know it's definitely true in our marriage, but what I hear from other chaplain families, that there's nothing wrong with obviously doing ministry in church settings and organizations and nonprofits and that sort of thing. But there's something about the calling of an Army chaplain or military chaplain that requires this kind of grittiness, if you will, or this calling to kind of really do life among military families and do something a little bit different. I know that was a huge factor in our own decision. And so when you guys came in, you were first assigned to Fort Stewart, which I very much relate to. That was our second assignment. Where we
really?
also, yes, where we also went through a deployment at Fort Stewart. So I must say, I've already had a chance to screen the movie. It's a fantastic movie, very well done. And if I can actually just say too, I know military families, we tend to be really particular about how movies are done, especially if it's about military. But I was really pleased as a military spouse. I was really pleased with the overall quality of the movie and how careful they were with the military lifestyle and some of those specifics. But for this movie, for this stage of your life, it's really talking about this first entry into the military community, your first assignment, which turned into your first deployment as well. And so I affectionately know Fort Stewart as the Marne Express. I'm not sure if it was described as that for you back then.
No.
It definitely was, it's not as intense as Fort Bragg is, but it is definitely an intense place to be, where there's lots of deployment rotations happening. So talk with us a little bit about what that was like for you to come into that first assignment, going from college ministry into military ministry.
We were truly deer in headlights. Neither of us had any family experience. We knew no one who'd served in the military. So Darren likes to say that he didn't even know how to spell lieutenant when he first came in. And so we signed in February, which they deployed in May. So as they were ramping up to go to, they went to JRTC locally because they didn't have enough time to go out west. They were starting to have the pre-deployment briefs. It's just where they start to prepare families for what to expect and just getting all of your affairs in order before you leave. And our commander was not married. And so they were asking for FRG leaders. I didn't really even know what FRG was, but I was so excited to jump in and help that I raised my hand. And so I really accidentally volunteered to be an FRG leader, and which I would never trade now because I learned so much and those friendships are so dear. He deployed just a few months after we settled in. And by this point, we had 3 children. So Ellie was 6, Samuel was 4, and Mary Beth was 10 months. And so we jumped in with both feet. It was very accurately portrayed that we were, young and green, and Darren is just gung-ho, and I'm just gung-ho, and we're going to save the world. Mm-hmm. And so quickly, just right at the beginning of that deployment, that summer is when it was just a very bad summer. They started pushing south of Baghdad off the main fobs, out to the villages where they were living and staying, into what they called mini fobs. Mm-hmm. And so that's when they started experiencing a lot of casualties and injuries.
Now, I also had the experience of serving on a care team, on a GO team. Was that something that you also had a chance to participate in as the FRG leader, really working with some of those families who had lost soldiers?
Yeah, so they did offer the care team training. So I think almost all of the FRG leaders went to the care team training. And so, it was great training, and it's just really tough because, you're kind of the liaison from the time that they get the knock on the door to find out that, their spouse has passed. For some of them may take days before their family can arrive or their help can arrive. So they do just need, in some ways, just, practical boots on the ground support of who's going to go pick up the kids after school. I was supposed to have, a meeting with the kids at teacher, and there are just all these very practical things, not to mention, of course, meals and things like that. Mm-hmm. But it's heart-wrenching because you're experiencing what they're in when it's very fresh, within hours of them finding out. And I think the hardest part for me was, or the hardest one of those for me was going to a house where there were children at home at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was a 12-year-old daughter, and no one could find her. And so we're looking around the house, and we open the coat closet to find her sitting in the floor of the closet, and she's got her dad's boots with her, and she's hiding in the closet, just trying to process what is happening all around her right now. And so it's very heavy. And we lost 19 guys that deployment, and had 99 serious injuries. So it felt like it was just constant.
That is a significant level of loss to go through during a deployment. And, I relate so much to what you're saying. It is I didn't know how to describe it. Other than calling it sacred spaces is what my husband and I had to, because there was something about being that care team leader or being that person that sits with those families that is such a sacred space. Like, it is such a sacred moment.
Yes.
That few people understand the intensity, the honor to be in that spot and to sit with someone in the first moments of their grief. And to also have to manage so much of what's going on inside you as well.
Right.
All I can say is that it's a huge honor to be a part of that. And it's definitely a life changer. And so I know that for you, significant loss that we'll talk about your husband here in a second and what some of his duties were as a chaplain during that deployment. But this was a significant experience for you to go through this deployment as an FRG leader, walking through just life and grief and loss with a lot of these families. So what was that like for you during the deployment? What changed in you while Darren was away?
I think what changed in me was just a sense of an ownership of the choice we'd made to go into the military. And, before it was always his career and I just took care of the kids. But with this, it was just very different. And those moments of working with the other women in leadership, but also walking through those sacred moments with people who are experiencing that, really, it became mine too. And it became not just his job or his vision. This was I was very much invested now in our life and in his ministry. It was our ministry now.
Because you had a lot of your own opportunity to serve in your own way while he was gone. And so this really does become us as a couple, what you are doing for service members during deployment, what I'm doing for families back at home. And it really is an us thing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, more than any other thing we'd experienced before.
And so for those who are listening who may not be familiar with all of what a chaplain does, they do a whole lot more than just counseling and maybe preaching in a chapel. So share with everybody a little bit of what Darren was doing during this deployment while you guys were apart.
He just spent a lot of time just being with the soldiers. So when they traveled to these remote locations, he would travel with them, just check in on them, play basketball with them. That was very accurate in the movie. Just really, Darren's he loves a good cigar, so he will just sit out late at night around a fire and smoke cigars. And so most of what he did during that deployment was just relationship building and just the ministry of presence, just being there when things went wrong, but also being there when things were going right. And, in the movie, they show Lance, who finds out his wife is pregnant and he's celebrating that. So, having those high moments and then having the relationship deposits invested in those friendships so that when the bottom does fall out, that he's established bridges there for them to have a safe place to go to. But yeah, so he would do Bible studies when he went out to all of these different locations, and just a lot of counseling. When in an infantry battalion, it's a lot of very young soldiers, a lot of very young marriages, a lot of very small children, a lot of struggling marriages. And so probably 90% of what he did was just talking with guys through their marriage relationships, through work struggles that they're having with their peers or their superiors. So really just the ministry of presence. And then for the guys who have tons of time on their hands, he would just have Bible study, and some of them would come just because they simply had nothing else to do. And so that was a really sweet time for him too. And then there were just days where, he's helped shovel and poop and digging out a place to put a tarp to have a swimming pool with everybody else. And yeah, so it's just, they're just living life together.
So I think this is a really good place in our conversation to pause and maybe show the trailer. So this is the trailer for Indivisible.
So today, 3rd and 4th platoons are going to sweep our next door neighbors again. See if we can slow down the welcome gifts coming over the wall. Hoo-ah! Hoo-ah!
I'd like for you to have more non-combat experience first, but a military-wide shortage of chaplains says otherwise.
Well, I signed up to be where the need is, sir.
15 months without this face.
Get out! We've got to move! Head down the northeast corner!
You're gonna be okay.
They can call it the family readiness group, but nobody's ever really ready.
Divorce is filed in the last 3 months. But soldiers losing families and having nothing to go home to is not the stabilizing force we need around here.
Really?
Just let me eat it. Messing with other people's lives just part of your job description or something.
I mean, kinda.
Okay, well, my marriage is none of your business. You don't know anything about me or my family.
Hey, who's gonna take this one?
This is for 2 RPGs, sir.
Get her down!
Couldn't save the chaplain.
So I guess
Do whatever it is you do.
I just feel like there's something more that's happening between us.
It's not between you two. It's between you two and that war.
Oh, we got 2 on the rooftop.
Get us out of here! Take them out! I trusted in God to protect those men, and he didn't!
No, you trusted in God to do what you thought he ought to do.
I want to know why. I want to know why you somehow have it in you to show up for those men when you refuse to do it for your own wife and kids.
Those men need me!
I need you!
Proud have laid their snares, and along the path they have set traps to catch me.
Give it to him, Chap.
You are my strong deliverer.
Right. Yep.
You shield my head in the day of battle.
Right. Yep.
Amen?
Is standing beside you.
So one of the things that really stands out to me about the trailer when I first saw it, before I even saw the movie, was this scene with Sarah Drew, who is April Kepner in Grey's Anatomy, fantastic actress. There's a scene where she's in the kitchen, well, they're in a kitchen, and they have this breakdown moment. This is after the deployment. This is, and again, I have to say, going back in the movie, we were just talking about deployment and how Heather and Darren had very different experiences during their deployment. And the movie does, honestly, Heather, a fantastic job of showing what it's like for a military couple to go through a deployment. Just that back and forth experience of what both of you could be going through in a day. So before we touch on that kitchen scene, let's talk about what was your experience of maybe watching the movie on that deployment section, because that really resonated with me. Like I've had those, conversations with my husband where he couldn't take the call when I really needed to talk. And so what was that like for you to watch that?
Yeah, it was very good for me to see his end of that. You feel like that they're so consumed and they're so busy that they don't really have the time, or I felt like we were just kind of inserted into his day, when really watching the movie made me realize that we were really what grounded him a lot of the time. Conversations were what grounded him. But back in those days, you did have to make your phone call in that phone center where you had 2 minutes and then that was it. And then there was this huge delay in conversation. So, and then obviously security issues. So there wasn't really a whole lot of good conversation happening. And because of the time limit and the delay, I would get off the phone almost just more frustrated. Like, this phone calls aren't helpful. I feel like we walk away feeling more distant somehow because he can't tell me what's happening. And I'm just telling him about the busyness of our life. And I'm realizing that makes him very sad. He's hearing everything that he's missing. So yeah, I think that just gave me a clearer picture of what it's like on their end.
Well, and what I loved about this so much is that there are so many movies out that talk about what it's like for the service members' perspective. A lot of people are drawn to war movies where you're seeing combat and you're seeing really heroic actions, which I think is very important for America to be able to see and honor and respect. But there are so few depictions or so few movies or TV shows that really do a great job of showing what it's like for families back at home and how that dynamic really kind of comes together and collides when you talk about reintegration. And so when you talk reintegration being when that military member comes home and the family is there to greet them, and then how do you establish this new normal of trying to live together again after so long of being apart and after you both have been through something so significant and life-changing. So let's talk about that kitchen scene for just a minute. I know that some movies is often scripting, but I will tell you that kitchen scene felt very familiar from a marriage perspective, from a ministry perspective. And so reintegration was obviously very difficult for you guys.
Yeah, the movie was great. And honestly, Darren and I feel like the movie made us look more noble in our struggle, that he was just really trying to serve his guys, and I was really trying to serve him. The reality of it is that we both just had just emotionally what you talked about, combat fatigue. We were both just so exhausted emotionally and so spent emotionally that we really just had very little to give each other, little patience, little understanding, little compassion. And so he came home very, very angry. And for him, that comes out very condescending and kind of know-it-all. So we would come to the point where I'm loading the dishwasher and he would come and reload the dishwasher and then fuss at me because I wasn't doing it right. Mm-hmm. Or, one night I made a meal and he was so angry that I had chosen the wrong kind of bread. He threw the whole meal in the trash can. And, his temper was disproportionate with the kids. The punishment was not proportionate with the offense with the kids. So at this point, I am now no longer allegiant. I'm now no longer allied to him. It's like us and the kids against him. And so now we're not fighting for each other. We're fighting against each other. And I'm trying to change his behavior and trying to force him to talk to me and trying to force him to deal with these issues. He just really wants nothing to do with us because my grappling at him was just overwhelming. And my expectations were not realistic for what I thought should be happening between the two of us.
And so what was it like from his perspective? What would he say if you were here? What would he say now that he was really hoping from his family? Did he feel misunderstood? Did he feel like he had a place to really process what he had gone through during a deployment? What was going on for him?
He would say, and he's very hard on himself, but he would say that he just came back very focused, self-centered, focused on himself. He'd spent 15 months thinking about, worrying about, being in charge of no one but himself. And so he would say he came back just fully self-absorbed. And he would also say that he had really drunk the Kool-Aid as far as his identity. And, it was no longer his identity in Christ or his identity as a husband or a dad. He really started to embrace this idea that he was in the Army and he was a chaplain and he was a soldier. And so now really that's what he was clinging to for his identity and his safety and his comfort. So in his mind, he would say, we just had nothing to offer him at that point. So he wasn't looking for anything from us. And the one thing he was getting from us was very stressful, which is the kids clamoring for his attention, me clamoring for something, he wasn't quite sure what I wanted from him. And honestly, he just was never home. And I would sit him down and say, we really have to talk about these issues. Our marriage is struggling and I don't know what's going on. And he would look at his watch and say, sorry, I've got to go for a run. Mm-hmm. And he would just be gone. And so he was just absent. That's really what I think he would say and was definitely true.
So there's so many things about what you're saying that I think military couples and military spouses would relate to. In fact, I hear from a lot of service members that when they go through, especially a longer deployment, that they really find themselves without even realizing it, getting into this place where they they are only taking care of themselves. They're only mindful of when they need to eat and where they need to go and what time they want to go to sleep. And so I remember actually visiting service members on an aircraft carrier and having this conversation with them where they were saying, we just get to a point where, there's no children running around here. So you don't even stop paying attention to what might be a safety hazard for children because you just get used to taking care of yourself. Right. And so there's so many military couples that would listen to what you're saying and go, we have had that dynamic where understandably, a service member comes home, whether they're a chaplain or whatever their MOS is, they come home and they've been in this mode, this pattern for so long, it's hard to readjust into family life, into kids and family meals and, everybody eating the same thing and him not just choosing what he wants to eat. And what is it about dishwashers? It's all about usually dishwashers is where the arguments happen every time, it's like the battleground of marriage and laundry. It's amazing. That's what I hear the most is a dishwasher. My husband and I had an argument over a water bottle, because I had my water bottle on the nightstand in a certain place and didn't even realize that's always where I kept it. So why should you move it? So right. It is a very stressful, intense time. And this is, if I can remind everybody, this is also back when our deployments were longer. Now our deployments are 6 months, 9 months, but this is when we're going 12 months, 15 months. So how long was that deployment for you guys?
That was a 15-month deployment,
and
they were threatening 18. I know, and it never occurs to you when you feel like you know someone so well, you just, because they tell you to expect these things when they deploy, and even the chaplain will brief the soldiers before they come home to expect these things. But when you know someone so well, you just cannot imagine that a person can change so much in such a short amount of time. Both of us change so much. And no matter what you're told or how well you're trained, I just don't think you get it until you actually experience it. And you walk that road and that person comes in the door and you realize we both have changed so much. It's as if we're going to have to figure out how to be married all over again.
So true. And you're right. 15 months is so long to have to redo that. And so you bring up a really interesting point in the fact that your husband is a chaplain. And I know in sharing my own story, what I often hear from people is I had no idea what goes on in a chaplain marriage. So many people accidentally, not on purpose, because the role of the chaplain is that we go to the chaplain for counsel. We go to the chaplain for marriage advice. We go to the chaplain when we're struggling with trauma or we're not dealing well, coming back home. That so few people think about what that might be like for a chaplain to come home from a deployment, that they're human too. And so I was so overjoyed to see this movie come out about a chaplain couple, because I think it does tell the story of what a military couple goes through, but specifically that people of faith, people that are in leadership positions can also struggle, and what an incredible message that is. And so I want to say thank you to both of you for being so vulnerable and sharing that message. It's not always easy to do that because you want people to feel like they can continue to come to you for help. But sometimes the best help that we can offer is to be able to say, me too, that this is something that we all go through and that this is not easy for anyone. And so talk with everyone about the fact that he's a chaplain and maybe some of the things that he experienced from a faith perspective, or that both of you maybe experienced from a faith perspective. Because a lot of people would say, why would a chaplain couple go through this when they're supposed to have the faith to withstand it, right? I know that that's not necessarily true, but what was that experience like for you?
I think for us, we had been believers. I had been a believer since 1991. This was 2007. So we'd grown quite a lot. We'd read all the right books. We'd been to all the right seminars. We'd had all of the counseling, the right counseling, but really I think the sanctification is what really the sanctification process. So when you come to faith, you are justified. So you are rightly positioned before the Lord, and that is resolved. But then the process of sanctification, or sanctifying, or becoming made more like the image of Christ, is lifelong. And for us, I would say, I really had so much to learn, and so did Darren, in terms of, for me particularly, just my view of marriage and my view of suffering, and how that came together was just, I really had grown to worship a good marriage, or made that my idol. And so all of my efforts in my relationship with Darren and then with my kids was really to create what I had in mind was this ideal godly marriage and godly family. But inadvertently, I had really put that on the throne, and that was driving my self-worth as well. So when our marriage did well, I felt worthy. When my marriage did poorly, I felt like such a failure, and it would make me doubt, who I was as a person. And so when he came back and our marriage was so falling apart, I share this with couples all the time. I'd gotten to the point where I felt like I'd made the biggest mistake of my life in marrying him. And so then I continuing to walk that down the road.
If I can pause you just for a second, why do you think that you felt that way at that time?
Because in my mind, everything I thought marriage was supposed to be was not happening. And everything I'd seen in other marriages happen that I thought, oh, that would never be me. That would never be us. That would never be me. All of it was happening to us. And so my conclusion was, and obviously this is Satan's lies that, creep in. But, my conclusion was we married the wrong people. We're so poorly suited for each other. And I'm not good enough. I'm not what he really wanted, because if he really wanted me, then he would check in and he would cherish this relationship and work on it. And so I was taking everything that he was dealing with on my shoulders, as if I had failed somehow. I had failed him, and so he didn't want me anymore. And so for me, when our marriage began to fail, I just felt like a failure, and that I had made a wrong decision. And if I misheard God on who I chose to marry, or maybe I misheard God on that we should go into the military, what else? How am I supposed to even hear God? Am I even a child of God? How am I supposed to ever go forward in my relationship with God if everything that's happened up to this point feels like a mistake?
So are you saying then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That was a true crisis of faith for me. I mean, to the point where it shakes your very foundation of me even wondering if I belonged to the Lord, if I even had the capacity to hear from the Lord.
And so you're saying that a lot of this kind of building up to this crisis of faith, you're saying was a lot because you realized that you were really worshiping the marriage. So in other words, as the marriage was falling apart, your faith was falling apart because your faith was too grounded on the foundation of the marriage instead of on God.
Yes. And just my performance as a wife and a mom, I think for women, it's so hard, the sin of just comparing ourselves to each other. And so constantly trying to figure out where I came out in that and how well I was doing. And really my self-worth was just so wrapped up in my performance. Now, mentally, intellectually, I knew that's not where my self-worth was, but practically I was just not walking it out. And honestly, I just feel like it was the Lord's goodness to send this into our lives to break that in us. And it took suffering. And so the big lesson for me in all of that was just that suffering can be a true gift from the Lord, and not to run away from suffering, or not to feel like suffering has come from Satan, or that suffering is an attack. Suffering actually can be a gift from the Lord to break things that are going to end up breaking you. And so for me, it was just coming to terms with the fact that, we may have a difficult marriage. We may not have what I had always thought was going to be this very tender and loving and thoughtful relationship. That's just not who we are, that's just not our marriage. And coming to terms with maybe that's how God designed it. Maybe that's what God wants in our lives, so that we don't grow too dependent on each other, so that we're constantly forced to look to the Lord to fill those needs, and not depend on Darren to give me my worth, which by the way, is an unbelievable burden to give to a man, to tell him he's supposed to make you feel better.
Yeah.
That's repulsive. And so there's so many lessons in there.
I think that was a process that I had to go through as well. In my own experience of receiving my husband home from a deployment, different. He was exhausted. He was, he had given everything, and he had done well, right? He had done well at his job, but the consequence for doing so well and being so excellent in his job was that he collapsed at home, and really struggled at home to kind of build back up. And I kind of had my own crisis, if you will, too, of like, what is it that we're doing? And would a calling ask this much of us? And I had to go through the same kind of crisis as well, to go, this is not the kind of life that I thought that I wanted. This is not the kind of marriage that I thought that I wanted. I thought that we were going to be not blissful all the time, but I thought that we weren't going to have to go through this kind of muck, this kind of difficulty. And I think I had to embrace and see my own selfishness in that, and realize, wow, I am, like you said, I'm putting so much pressure on my husband to be perfect, as if he can't struggle. Like, you shouldn't struggle because you're supposed to be stronger than that, and I've been thinking a lot lately how some of the things that we project on our spouses is a lot of what's falling through the cracks for us. So while I won't speak that for you in your marriage, but for me, I was projecting, asking him to have it together, to be perfect, to not struggle. But I couldn't do that for myself. I was asking him to be the strength for both of us. And that's where I had to see my own kind of ugliness, if you will. And I wonder if that is kind of a rite of passage for a lot of military spouses, that we kind of come into this lifestyle and it's like really awesome and it's patriotic, and we get to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, whether you're a chaplain family or a military family. First responders, I see a lot in first responder couples, we're serving our community, we're doing something that's valuable, and then it gets hard. And then the consequences of that kind of lifestyle creep into your marriage. And then you have to figure it out. And then you have to ask yourself, who am I? Who am I going to be? And what are my expectations of my spouse and my marriage? So you're right. So many lessons in all of that, for sure.
Yeah. And I think even for non-military families, non-service,
Yes.
people in service roles have to go through that. It's the term is the 7-year itch, but honestly, I do see that pattern in couples where they hit that, somewhere between 5-10 years, where they really are having to redefine their relationship and what they're willing to do to keep that marriage working, because it gets to that point of the hump where things just get harder. You just get tired, and typically families by that time have small children. Typically women are consumed with parenting, and the husband tends to take the back seat at that point. And so I think there's just a lot of factors that typically happen in that stage of marriage, but especially when you make a decision, particularly for chaplains, because chaplains, what most people don't know, are generally older than the people that they work with, because they've had to do more schooling. And so often when we come into service, we are at that place where we have small children already, or children already. And so there's some different dynamics there too, particularly for chaplains coming into service.
Yeah, for sure. And again, this is such an incredible story for those that really want to see what it's like for a chaplain family. But like you said, even those that are outside the military are going to relate in their own marriage story to what you talk about and what the movie is about. I'd love to ask you about this turning point, because a turning point happened for you guys. And that's really what the story is about, right? So many couples go through difficulty and suffering, whether it's life issues, medical issues, deployments, family issues. So much can go wrong in a relationship and in your story. But this is a story about redemption and restoration in a family. We need more stories like that. And so what was the turning point for you and for Darren?
So when we tell our story, Darren will start by saying, well, we had been separated and we're not living together and had been that way for 4 months. So he, as a chaplain, was just sofa surfing with his friends. Meanwhile,
and was that his decision, or was that your decision, or mutual?
Mine. I asked him to leave. Yeah, he was not tracking. He was utterly, even though I had been saying for months, we have got, this is critical mass. When I told him, he left for airborne school, and I said, this needs to be the beginning of us, you deciding if you're willing to check back in with us, and if you're willing to engage and figure out what's going on. I wanted us to go to counseling. I wanted us, I was just desperate to save our marriage. But by this point in our marriage, there had been so many promises that he had made and broken that I had been so crushed and so hurt that by this point, I was done. So when he left the house, in my mind, our marriage was over. I started packing our bags. I found a place to live back home. I opened my own credit cards, my own checking account. I truly was done with our marriage. Darren was devastated. He would say himself, he was not taking me seriously all of those times when I had tried, really a year I had been talking to him, and that it wasn't until I said, don't come back home, that he took me seriously. And so for that 4 months, he would say it was just a process of him being broken. He continued to just try to fix the marriage. He was continuing to try to just do whatever I wanted him to do. And it was for Darren, the progression was one day we were switching off the kids. So we had it so that he would have the kids some days and I would have kids the other days. And he had dropped the kids off with me, and as they went from his car to my car, whatever happened in that moment, he just broke. I guess seeing the practical expression of what this meant, the consequences of what this meant, of his lack of humbling himself and saying, Lord, search me, figure out, show me what it is that I need to see going on. And so from that day forward, he was just a broken man. He was no longer trying to fix our marriage. He was no longer trying to please me. He was truly seeking the Lord. And I saw that in him, and I could see that little bits by little bits. And then this one particular day, I was sitting in my kids' rocking chair where I'd rocked all of them, packing my boxes, and I was just broken at the same time. And there's really nothing that happened. I just came to the point where I realized it was just a surrender. I can choose the Lord's way, and he prefers marriage. He's for marriage. There are reasons for divorce, but he is for marriage. And if he is for it, then will he really equip us for that? And I had to come to terms with the fact that even if we have a difficult marriage, I would rather be in a difficult marriage in the Lord's will than pursue my own interests and pursue my own desires and be out of his will, experiencing what I knew would not be peace and blessing for my children. And so that day, I just surrendered, and I just said, I'm willing to walk this road of difficult marriage simply because you said that's what we should do. And it was as if blinders fell off my eyes in that moment, to where literally just that one baby step of obedience and that one baby step of surrender made the next step even easier, and made the truth even clearer, and made the next step even clearer. So it really only takes just one tiny baby step of surrender, and the Lord will meet you there. And he met me there. And so by the end of that afternoon, Darren had come home to the house to swap the kids out. He just walked in the room and just broke down in my arms. And that was it. I decided that day, we're going to work this out, for better or for worse. And my guide is no longer how I feel about our marriage. My guide is no longer how well I perform in this marriage. My guide from here on out is, I will do this as unto the Lord, regardless of what the outcome is. And so that was our turning point. So slowly I began to warm to him, but it truly took a full year for my emotions to catch up with my willful decision. So he moved back into the house. We did get out of the Army for a year, and he resigned his commission. For people that don't know what that means, that he quit, which is a really, really big deal. He resigned his commission. We moved back to Atlanta for a year. We got under some really good counseling care. We got involved in a really good church, and we just spent that year really getting to know each other again under new terms of we're okay if neither of us gets it right. And that's not what we're going to look for anymore, is for the other one to get it right for our sake. But it took a full year before I had those warm fuzzies and was glad that we were back together kind of emotions. So it was a very long process. But I can say on the other side of it, our relationship now is so much richer, so much more. This is genuine agape love for each other now. And
if I can point out and just stress, because you're stressing it as well, and I just want to back that up, that what you're saying is that you decided to pursue your marriage even though you didn't feel like it. That you went after your marriage because you felt like it was what God was calling you to do, that God was for marriage, that he had not released you and given you those grounds for divorce, and that you trusted that a God that could provide for you and strengthen you and show you these steps. And that, again, this was a full year before you emotionally felt those feelings probably of security or emotional stability and maybe that connection coming back again, but that you chose obedience within a safe relationship. So if I can just stress that caveat just for a second, that there might be those that are listening that are maybe not in a safe relationship, where if there's any abuse or if there's anything that's destructive in your marriage that causes you to feel that you are not physically safe, that we would encourage you to get that professional help. But in Heather's circumstance, there wasn't that physical lack of safety. It was the emotional disconnect. It was the marriage disconnect and the misunderstanding that was going on between the two of them. And when I say misunderstanding, that's not a light misunderstanding. This is a misunderstanding of completely separate experiences and then trying to come back and reintegrate, which means to reconnect, come together, collaborate, find a new normal. It doesn't have to be the way that it used to be. Yeah. And so that's a choice that we have in marriage to decide, can we together create a new normal? Yes. But that takes a lot of selfless sacrifice to go, I know from a spouse perspective, self-sacrifice to go, maybe I don't have it all right. Maybe my way of working with the kids isn't the only way. Maybe my way of doing the dishwasher isn't the best way all the time. But really a lot of that self-sacrifice to go, even though I don't feel like loving you, I'm going to choose to act like I love you. Would that be an okay way to say it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, I've never believe in the statement, fake it till you make it. But in the case of obedience, and particularly in marriage, just the practice of making loving choices, making choices to be kind and to serve another person, it really does have a formative effect on your heart. Obviously has to be from the inside out, the work of the Holy Spirit in your heart. But like I said, that first choice, that first decision to surrender does bring clarity to the truth, and does bring clarity and the power to make that next good choice to love your spouse. And the Lord's promises are true. He does equip us for what he's called us for. And so he will restore all of those other parts of that relationship. But for me, and what we needed to learn, for me, I just had a lot of growing up to do and not living by my emotions. And so this was the journey that the Lord had for me in order to sort that issue out. And may look very different for someone else, but for me, and for the Lord to bless me with a truly beautiful marriage, he knew that he had to take that false foundation away from me. And as painful as it was, I'm so thankful. And I still try to crawl back up on that foundation all the time. And so it's a constant constant crushing, and we still are just difficult people. We just haven't. We're not one of those couples that just get along. We're both very strong-willed people, or very opinionated people, and so it's just a constant work in our lives. But now we see each other not as each other's enemies, but as each other's battle buddy in it now, that we're fighting for each other, not against each other, usually.
Well, all right. And I also appreciate the fact that you're saying that this wasn't something that just one person had to work on, that both of you had to show up for your marriage. So often I hear military spouses and first responder spouses that will say, I just want him to go first. Like, I'm tired. I'm doing all the work. I'm watching the kids. I'm, asking for the marriage counseling. I'm, asking for the Bible study, or I'm asking for things to change. And then you reach that point and you just kind of accept the resentment instead, and the bitterness. And you just go, you know what? I'm tired. You go. Yeah. And what your story and your message is really about two people who decided that they wanted to be for each other, and that two people came together to work on that. But I'm hearing also, Heather, that you took responsibility for your side of it and said, I'm going to choose to be obedient, and that I don't have control over Darren's decisions.
Yeah, and then it's so funny. The commander's wife during that deployment had us all T-shirts made for the FRG leaders, and it said, "Put your big girl panties on." Yes. And so, as you're talking, I'm thinking, yeah. In your marriage, sometimes you got to put your big girl panties on and realize the same Holy Spirit that He gave your husband to rise up to the occasion, He gave you too to rise to the occasion, and that's why two are better than one, because sometimes he can't. He's down, and you've got to be the one who is going to seek the Lord on behalf of each other. And I want Darren to be the rescuer and the protector, but the reality is God gave us to each other to be that for each other. And sometimes he's taking the lead in that fight, and he's just dragging me, unwillingly by one arm. And sometimes spiritually that it's the other way around. And yeah, I think you're exactly right.
So this movie that's now coming out, strange, I'm sure, to have your life, even remotely portrayed on a screen, with fantastic actors that did such a great job respecting your story. I think I want to ask, what is your overall message? As couples are going to see this movie, what would you want them to walk away with?
I would love for couples to walk away feeling the freedom to be broken, and feeling the freedom to share their deepest fears and insecurities about their marriage, about their parenting, about their relationships in general. We have so many relationships, that people would no longer, especially people of faith, Christians particularly, would no longer feel like that they have to maintain this false sense of having arrived, because none of us have arrived until we shed these cumbersome bodies. And so I really hope that people walk out of that theater and will turn to their spouse or turn to their parent, whoever, and say, you know what, I'm broken and I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go from here. And I'm broken and hopeless. And until you get to that point, I don't think that you are able to take the next step of walking through healing and the process of working on it. So I really just hope people will find security in knowing that brokenness can be a blessing, and that brokenness is a beautiful thing. And that's where, beauty comes from, the ashes of those broken things, and being secure enough in the Lord that He can handle that. He can handle your admission, because He already knows it. And not running from the fear that this was the biggest mistake of my life, and it cannot be turned around and it cannot be repaired, because that's just not true. If anyone was at the place of disrepair, I would say I was there. I was gone and I was done. I had no desire to continue in that relationship. And so if the Lord can restore my heart from the dark place that it was, then there is hope for anyone out there.
And I think if you're going to go out and see this movie, it comes out October 26th. my encouragement would be to make it a date night, to really go out as a couple and watch this movie together, and to not just go see the movie and then, that's it, go home, but to really allow yourself some kind of cushion where you can go and see the movie and then have a place of conversation, go out for coffee or get a cup of coffee and sit in the car. I can't tell you how many times my husband and I have seen a very a vulnerable movie that really moved us both. And we just sat in the car for hours and just talked about how did that impact our perspectives. And so this is one of those movies that I would highly encourage those listening to don't just go to this movie flippantly. Go to it with intentionality, that it can start conversation for your marriage, that it might be able to give you some words in your communication that you maybe didn't have before. But I do believe that it's going to set your hearts in the right place to have that healthy conversation. Because like Heather is saying, it is a movie about restoration. It's a hopeful movie for your marriage. And so if you're looking for hope, if you're looking for a direction, if you're looking for a good story that's true, that can remind you that your marriage can turn around, even if you don't know how to do it, that this movie can be a discussion starter for what that can look like for your life. So Heather, thank you for just sharing your story, for joining me today, for sharing the vulnerability of your own walk of faith and how it's gone through this roller coaster ride. I think that's accurate of almost everybody. For those that might be listening that are chaplain families, I can't stress to you enough, coming from two chaplain spouses, how important it is to take care of your own faith system, to take care of your own relationship with God, to know that you don't have to be perfect, that your marriage doesn't have to be perfect, and for goodness sake, your spouse does not have to be perfect either, and that we are all in this together, and that we can provide stories of hope based off of our authenticity of what our walk with God is like. That can sometimes be the best ministry that's out there.
Thanks for listening to the Life Giver podcast. If you're enjoying these conversations as being free of advertising or sponsorship, please help me by spreading the word to other military and first responder families that might benefit from the show. If you'd like to find out more about me or Life Giver, you can find more information at www.coreyweathers.com or life-giver.org.